Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to give a warm welcome to all our audience to our Design Impact Global Summit. In name of the Design School's Alumni Council, I invite you to follow the sun during these 2 days and reflect on each one's mission in this world, to think, as you walk through each of our amazing sessions, what the challenges of today represent in the intersection of health, equity, and climate change. In doing this, and for the purpose of a better future, I want you to focus on how design transcends regional and national boundaries, how innovation in design and technology can meet ancient or indigenous techniques and transform community-driven initiatives. We want to challenge each one of you to share our mission, make change happen through design. We need to look forward, but learning from the past. We need to design for inclusiveness and justice. We need to further our thinking and integrate nature in our design solutions and strengthen equitable community development. Let's design for positive impact. We need to act now and refine our approaches to preserve and regenerate our world, one action at a time. Our next session, Global Gardens, Reimagining Infrastructures Towards a More Regenerative and Equitable Future, brings together a panel of inspiring thought leaders and design activists from Latin America. They will present new opportunities for designers to transform infrastructure design through innovative, community-based strategies and cultural adaptation. Our panelists are Rafa Marangoni. He's an urban designer at Sasaki, and he's in Brazil and New York. Soledad Patiño is an architect, urban designer, and an IDB consultant. She's from Argentina. Barbara Schmidt is accompanying us as well. She's the president of Rede Vencer Juntos from Brazil and Germany. Carolina Zambrano is the global lead of climate justice at IVOS. She's from Ecuador. And finally, we have Felix Jaime Vaca. He's the Director of Land Management and Urban Planning, Puerto Viejo Municipality in Ecuador. Our moderator is Juan Villalon, who is currently a candidate for the Masters of Urban Design at Harvard's GSD. Thank you for joining us. So Keith will join us in a video recording. So please go ahead.
Keith Pizzoli. I'm a teaching professor at the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I direct here the Bioregional Center for Sustainability Science, Planning and Design. I'm honored to introduce this panel. I want to congratulate Adriana Rojas for pulling this together and the other organizers. I think the title of it is fantastic. Global Gardens, Reimagining Infrastructures Towards a Regenerative and Equitable Future. I'd also like to thank Professor Isabel Studer for recommending that I do this introduction. So this is an image of where I grew up on the Great South Bay. I'm on the front of the boat digging clams. It's a kind of a commons. You could think of this as a global garden, to use the language of the organizers. I dug clams there and fed people far and wide with those. Unfortunately, the planetary urbanization and the runoff into the bay killed the clams, and so this is no longer a viable commons. So we got to figure out how to deal with keeping these productive landscapes or productive waterways alive and well as a part of the challenge. Here's the challenge that was given to the presenters, which is kind of daunting, and it goes like this: identify opportunities for designers to transform infrastructure design through innovative community-based strategies and cultural adaptation. Inspire designers to proactively create regenerative and more equitable cities and communities. Okay, that's a challenge, all right. So it's like inspire us with transformational vision and actionable design. So what I'm showing you here to sort of relate my own work to what the panelists will be talking about is an effort to co-create with community a transformational design of a vacant lot into a community garden and food forest. That site 10 years ago was a garbage-strewn site. It's now a thriving community garden and food forest and neighborhood environmental learning center. So my experience of this is sort of really had me connecting with what I read about the panelists and what they're doing and what you'll be hearing from them. This is just an image of the site now. That was a vacant brownfield site. It's now, like I said, a thriving community garden, food forest, and neighborhood learning center. Now, I did read the material that the panelists shared, and what I'd like to do now is list 3 cross-cutting themes that struck me in the presentations that you're about to hear. One is planetary urbanization is extractive and unjust. It impoverishes rural wealth and degrades vital urban-rural interdependencies. This particular theme was really hit hard with Soledad Patiño's presentation with focused on fracking that you'll hear about, kind of devastating the landscape there, describing urbanization, that this extended landscape of urbanization reaching into these productive landscapes and wreaking havoc. The second theme, a regenerative and just future, requires design imagination and innovation with compelling stories, narratives of alternative development, valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And 3 of the panelists really kind of get into that, begin to stretch the notion of infrastructure, including, blue, green, and gray infrastructure as on the agenda. And so, for instance, Carolina Zambrano Barragan talks about the Amazon and places an emphasis on justice-oriented nature-based solutions to climate change. And she brings into the story the value and importance of traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and that's important. Felix Jaime Baca turns our attention to natural disasters and talks about how bringing in global development finance through an activated, localized civic planning is really important. And so there's another example of this need to be articulating an alternative kind of development, this second cross-cutting theme. And Rafael, likewise, he focuses on Sao Paulo, Brazil, and he sheds light on ways in which infrastructure can be repurposed. For instance, railways, which can allow for the appropriation of land to be converted or regenerated into productive landscapes. The last cross-cutting theme, that all 5 of the presenters touch on, is the community mobilization and civic engagement are critically necessary to make sure cyber infrastructure and digital technologies, for instance, spatial analytics, mapping, modeling, scenario planning, serve the public effectively. In other words, advance social and environmental justice. So Barbara Schmidt-Ramer talks about this from the perspective of energizing the demos, the will of the people. And she studied and will present a fascinating case, a new alliance that she was part of and studied to design alternative infrastructure. And that included 3,000 NGOs building 1,000 water tanks, design that sort of drew inspiration from ancient technologies as a path forward for powering women. So moving forward, forgive me, I'm going quickly. I know I don't have a whole lot of time to do this. So I'm going to just relate a little bit. I want to echo those themes that I just mentioned that the panelists hit on with some work that we're doing in the San Diego-Tijuana city region. This is where I live. It's 5 million people living in this area. It spills across the international border, which you can see here. That's the border. This is San Diego. Over here is Tijuana. Now, one of the challenges that you're going to hear the panelists speak about is the difficulty of merging a kind of ecological with the fragmented jurisdictional legacy that we have with international state boundaries not conforming to the kind of watersheds. What you see here is this US-Mexico border, and you see these white polygons are watersheds, and these colored areas are sort of ecological regions, microclimatic biome regions. And the fragmentation is really tremendous. So to do planning in a context like this is really difficult. And it's especially important, though, because if you look at the border region, you have this unbelievable disparity in health and well-being. This darker color in this key is infant mortality. So this was one metric. Infant mortality on the Mexican side is really much worse. So we bring a bioregional perspective into the work that we're doing. The bioregion being relating the urban area with the working lands and the natural landscape of a larger sort of unit of analysis. And the bioregion is becoming a bit more, I guess, utilized in planning and design literature. And here's an example of how the bioregional perspective comes into view in the San Diego-Tijuana border case. You see here the south part of our city region, on the Mexican side, there's a south-north tilt. And so the drainage through that watershed comes into into the US side and is damaging the estuary, which you could think of as blue infrastructure. And it affects the local farm there. So this is a real challenge, and taking a bioregional frame helps us narrate more the necessity to do more of a collaborative engagement with different people, different entities at different scales to get to a regenerative and equitable future. Here's an example of some of the work that we've done in that area to avoid erosion on the Mexican side. Permeable pavers as a form of green infrastructure, bringing students out there, and to get our mind around the sort of scope of the working area where the city region is embedded in a larger landscape that has been populated or inhabited by the Kumeyaay Indians for 10,000 years. So they helped us get this sense, and then we turned that into a planning and decision support model in the form of this solid terrain model, which is fascinating and beautiful to look at and very effective to get people understanding where they live in the context. Now, in addition to that kind of modeling, we've created these maps, these asset maps that on the left, you see site suitability analysis of vacant lots for urban ag use. So I don't have time to go into all the details on this stuff, but this has been very effective to identify what vacant lots in the region are good for urban agriculture or for putting green infrastructure in the form of urban forestry, trees, lining trees with the streets. On the right is an Agricultural Incentive Zoning Act that we were able to identify what kind of tax relief property owners could get if they let their land be used for green infrastructure and urban agriculture in particular. So these are the kinds of tools. Here's another one, an asset map. And I'd be happy to share these tools and this information with anybody that wants to learn more about it. But here's an example that we're using with crowdsourcing. So students are able to identify food growing in different communities in the city region and tell stories about it and make it part of a database that we can use. Now, I'm already at 10 minutes, so I've only got another minute or so. What I want to end off with is where we're heading now. And I think something that you might find useful if you're not already aware of it. And it's this notion of digital twins. A digital twin is basically a virtual replica of some physical structure. So you could create a digital twin of a spacecraft, of a piece of machinery, of a building, and increasingly now of an entire city. And so we are going to work the San Diego-Tijuana border region and create a virtual digital twin of the San Diego-Tijuana city region with the focus on green infrastructure. So we're going to kind of map the tree canopy and things like bioswales, urban agriculture, the wetlands, and do that. And I can't get into all the details of a digital twin, but what I did here was I pulled out some literature for those of you that want to learn more. If you have access to this PowerPoint, you can see some really great stuff being written about digital twins. Here's just one example of what we're doing to try to build a kind of layers to eventually create a robust, active, pulls in live, real data. Is this effort to create what we're calling the agile testbed, advancing green infrastructure for learning and equity. And here's where we have this layer of vacant lots, and we're identifying places where we can install food forests, and we're putting that against the perspective of the watershed. And this is really great stuff. So here's, like, I think my penultimate slide. So we've backed up and we're trying to now look at the US-Mexico border region from a bioregional perspective and to begin to sort of develop a model for visualizing these city regions, irrespective of the border. So we're trying to create a bioregional frame around these to do this kind of asset mapping, the agile network, advancing green infrastructure for learning and equity, involving the community. There's a kind of ecological literacy associated with it. And here's the last slide. For those of you who are interested in the bioregional perspective that I'm sharing, and I would think that the 5 panelists already have a kind of a bioregional ethos operating in their thinking, whole systems relating the planetary urbanization of productive lands, working lands, natural spaces. So there's going to be this really neat bioregional city planning and design conference coming up soon. And so if you're interested in that, there's the date on it, and we could provide more information on it. So I've got to end. I went a couple minutes over. I hope that's okay. I wish I could be with you. I think the panelists are going to do a great job. I learned a lot from reading their material. I thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to do this introduction. So, and my contact information is on the first slide. Thank you. And hopefully I'll be running into some of you at some point in the future.
Next up is Rafael Marangoni. He's from José dos Campos, Sao Paulo. His research project and master thesis, Extra Metropolis 2020, investigated design strategies of applying current urbanistic instruments in Sao Paulo as a regional framework for the development of the state of Sao Paulo's Tren Intercidades regional rail vision. The framework explores the relationship between urban form and transportation, looking towards models for sustainable urbanization. Rafael is part of Sasaki's planning and urban design practice in Boston. Go ahead, Rafa.
Well, greetings to everyone joining us. I am excited to be a part of this discussion and appreciate the invitation to contribute. I'm Rafael Marangoni. I am an architect and urban designer. Today I'll be presenting my previous research, originally titled Extra Metropolis. This was a part of studies looking into regional urbanization processes in the state of Sao Paulo and the shapes it takes. This was made possible through the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies through the Brazilian Cities Grant from 2019. This was later developed as a thesis advised by Rahul Mehrotra, Renee Tapp, and Gabriel Kozlowski at the Graduate School of Design. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement and acknowledge Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts nations. I acknowledge that the land today known as Sao Paulo is the traditional unceded territory of the Guarani, Tupi, and Tamoios. I also acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of these territories, as long as the ongoing processes of colonialism and dispossession in which we and our institutions are implicated. For the talk today, I'd like to introduce some main topics of Sao Paulo, global gardens, and the future of infrastructure. Sao Paulo being the city and state of the Southeast Brazil, encompassing one of the largest urban regions of the Americas. Global gardens being an interpretation of a system in which vast regions are inserted into a globalized capitalist economy with a specific role of extraction and exploitation, and the future of infrastructure being a study, in this case, within this region, of the Tren Intercidades project, or TIC, meaning the intercity train, which is a real project to connect over 30 million people along 400 kilometers within the state of Sao Paulo, currently being studied by the state government. These topics come together in the sense that Sao Paulo's past growth relied on its status as a global garden, which enabled development of regional infrastructure, allowing a unique process of regional urbanization spanning over 2 centuries. Which leads us to a research question and talk theme for today, which is how can the future of infrastructure in Sao Paulo build on the legacy of the global garden period and lead to a more sustainable regional urbanization? But before we look into the future, let's look into the present and see what Sao Paulo looks like today for context. And we see Sao Paulo as this never-ending city with barriers of buildings sprawling as far as the eye can see. In a very unique morphology, Sao Paulo spans in several directions with impressive growth, which leads us a bit to the question as well as where does Sao Paulo begin and where does it end? Leading us to the scales of analysis that are important to understand in this talk. The state scale, the macro metropolitan scale, the metropolis scale, and the city. These four scales are distributed in Sao Paulo as both administrative and geographic divides encompassing different densities within this area. The four scales are the state, as I mentioned, the macro metropolis, the metropolitan region, and the city of Sao Paulo. And it's important to notice that Sao Paulo's agglomerations happen mainly in three scales: the city, metro, and macro metro areas. Even though the outlines of these divisions seem vast, the majority of the population is concentrated in very specific parts of this region, in which we can see that the city of Sao Paulo has remarkable concentration and an agglomeration of people, occupying 0.6% of the state's land, yet being home to 27% of its population, roughly 12 million people living within the city of Sao Paulo. This region is shaped through a variety of infrastructure currently. And again, looking at these scales and looking at the urban footprints of the state, we note that the main transportation connector here, the main infrastructure that is within the state of Sao Paulo today, is road infrastructure. Yet this builds on the historical development of rail infrastructure that formerly connected these cities and that allowed for the original growth and geographic extent of this urban pattern that we see today. This urban pattern that we see today is a process of both state growth, but also the concentration and deconcentration furtherly of cities across the state. And noticing here that Sao Paulo, even though is massive today, was a fairly small region not too long ago. The city, even more impressively, at the late 1800s, was a city of roughly 30,000 people. So fairly unremarkable in terms of its scale and of its presence in Brazil. A lot of this growth in the 20th century expands both in the city and in areas beyond the municipal divisions, as we can see here, which leads us to the question of Sao Paulo's regional urbanization as a global garden in this period of accelerated growth that it went through. Sao Paulo as a state has a rich geography and topography. Some of these areas that are more prominent for the production of coffee were in the northwest of the state, apologies, and in the higher areas of the topography. The darker blues that we see here represent higher topographical municipalities. These areas were connected through rail that were almost as a negative of the topography that we see here, seeking out higher grounds and further north and west of the state as a ways to consolidate its production of coffee that was a predominant commodity at the time and a very profitable business that allowed for this expansion to happen initially. These consolidated over time a variety of regional centers that were enabled and developed around the rail infrastructure as we know them today, and built infrastructure, built other economies within and around these connection routes that the coffee infrastructure allowed. So these cities and their growth owe a lot to the rail infrastructure and allowed for, at the time, a morphology of concentrated buildings around the infrastructure of the rail and a very dense setting of cities. It's important to remind ourselves, though, that this infrastructure no longer exists as it did prior to development of highways. Today, the road infrastructure replaced the rail infrastructure, and we're left with the rail infrastructure mainly for cargo, which leads us to the discussion of the TIC, and which is the most recent attempt to reclaiming rail as a regional structure for cities. The route in green represents one of the most recent iterations of a project in the study at the state level to develop about 400 kilometers of rail within the macro metro area of Sao Paulo. It's seen as an opportunity to generate sustainable development and shift away from Sao Paulo's car dependency and sprawl. It builds on the right-of-ways that were used for the coffee economy period in Sao Paulo, and this would be an infrastructure that, even though is using those right-of-ways in that previous route, would be focused not on exporting value from the country to other markets, rather one that looks into regional development as a path forward. In my research, I argued that this would represent a tremendous opportunity to reconsider how urban development can also happen around rail infrastructure in the Sao Paulo macro metropolitan area. And in a way, we could think the rail line as a regional armature for metropolitan-oriented planning at the scale of the macro metropolis. And this leads us to the question of, if we're thinking at the metropolitan scale, what can we learn from Sao Paulo's metropolitan experience in terms of planning growth and coordinating where and how the city will develop? And Sao Paulo's experience builds on understanding regional infrastructure going across the city to consolidate what are known as the metropolitan structuring zones, rescaling the city, creating new types of habitable, livable, desirable locations. Looking into the urban infrastructure that's afforded in the city, it creates a series of corridors building on transit-oriented development and access to infrastructure and services. And in the middle of this, we also have even more concentrated sites of redevelopment and reconsideration of urbanistic parameters, the urban operations. All of these instruments, even though they're small in their footprint in terms of what we could think about as a metropolitan structuring, are fairly effective in terms of reaching a significant amount of the population, knowing that the population of Sao Paulo is so concentrated where it is. And these are all instruments that are foreseen and detailed within federal laws applied to local contexts, often operated by the municipalities' planning commissions. And as we can think about, this presents an opportunity to inform macrometropolitan growth from metropolitan instruments. So even though these are small in terms of their scale, when we think about the macrometropolitan area, we can remind ourselves that Sao Paulo's urban agglomeration characteristics allow it to be spread out in only a handful of areas. So the density is quite significant within the municipalities themselves, which would make sense then to see this opportunity of using these instruments that are considering a very dense environment and a limited amount of sites to act on as an interesting and potential way to structure growth that would reach a large amount of people. And in this context, we look into Campinas, which is the second largest metro area of the macro metropolitan area, and thinking about the rail as a starting point for this discussion of how we could reimagine these instruments applied systematically across the TIC route, in which we'd have a station for the TIC, a consideration for a site of a block scale, and a consideration for an urban scale intervention with corridors reaching out to other areas of the city, leading us to this idea of a pilot for Campinas, in which again we'd have a site, we'd have the idea of corridors, integrating those corridors with the city, and the city at large as a part of a network of sites that are being rethought and reconsidered and redesigned around this regional connector. And here the exercise looks into the site itself for Campinas, even though there are so many sites across this train network that would be similar to this and that could have replicable instruments being played out. The main idea here is to really assess the viability in this exercise and to see whether something proposed as such would be desirable or even feasible to other locations as well. In terms of rescaling the location, bringing in new programs, consolidating it with urban fabric activities and opportunities within the scale of the block scale in and around the station, and expanding that type of intervention through the city, thinking about the idea of the corridors, the urban corridors of transit-oriented development, building on the largest pre-existing transportation axes that we have. These would be coordinated through guidelines, integrating density and mobility throughout the city, allowing for higher densities and lower densities, while giving a fast access in terms of mobility options to reach both the site and the regional gateway, but also other locations across the city. And through concepts that could be flexible enough, we can see that this applied framework could be potentially desirable for other locations as well, using adaptive density, accessibility to other areas, and a station intervention connecting tissue in the city. And in that way, we can think about this framework not as being only an exercise specific to Campinas, but something that could be scalable to other locations across the TIC network. And we can envision a new way of repurposing the infrastructure that was once designed to extract coffee for the markets of the world and transform this infrastructure into one that is generative and sustainable for the people of Sao Paulo across the entire TIC network as a way of rethinking the future of infrastructure, building on the legacy of what was once the global garden's main access for its purposes. And with that, I think we can imagine what that would look like, and the potential and opportunities that would allow for a regional development framework to build on these very specific sites, these very concentrated densities, and by reproducing them and by reconsidering them and recontextualizing them, we'd be able to achieve a regional framework in the macro metropolitan area of Sao Paulo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Now we will go with Soledad Patiño, who is an urban designer working at the Inter-American Development Bank. Please, Soledad.
Thank you, Juan, for the presentation. Excited to be here and part of this conversation. Today, I will show you some insights and thoughts from a research project I did in 2019 and 20, and that started as a fellowship and grant we got at the GSD together with Stefano Romagnoli. The research started by understanding Patagonia, which is located in the southern region of Argentina, as a global garden, and understanding global gardens as the other side of global cities. This means a strongly natural territory with emerging communities, towns, and cities, but with a really global appreciation. If you go to the next one, so Patagonia is global precisely because it is connected to a network of international trade and planetary infrastructures. So this map shows where oil and gas reserves are located in the world today, and how all these are connected to a global transportation system that moves resources to the main centers of consumption. And in 2010, Argentina discovered the second largest unconventional oil and gas reservoir in the world. This is the Vaca Muerta Basin, which is located in northern Patagonia and is marked in the map. And if we go to the next one, we'll see that the Vaca Muerta Basin covers an area of 38,000 square kilometers. And until today, only the 3% of the deposit has been exploited. However, in less than a decade, the entire landscape and urban territory has rapidly changed, with serious consequences for both the environment and local communities. The technique that is used to recover gas in Vaca Muerta is fracking. Fracking consists in pumping huge volumes of water, chemicals under pressure to crack the bedrock in the subsoil so that shales can flow and emerge in the surface. And this, what you see in the photo, is a traditional fracking plot. Fracking plots tend to be these large cleared portions of land, which full of storage tanks and other machinery. But what happens, and if we go to the next one, is that the life of each oil well is only about 2 years. However, fracking sites ruin the land for decades. It's really difficult to recover that soil for other purposes once the process has stopped. So the question is about productivity and regeneration, and how long it takes, or what regeneration means if it takes too long to recover this land. Thinking in all this question, and if we go to the next slide, what we were trying to do with our project was to map socio-environmental conflicts, inequities, and the impacts that the fracking process was having in the process of urbanization as a starting point for new urban planning policies, and also thinking in mapping as an opportunity to make visible things that are not being shown. So I will show you now some of those maps and some of the insights and concepts we got from the research. The first idea or concept is that fracking is creating here a new geography of urbanization. So this map shows the extension of the Vaca Muerta Reservoir. It is also a map of water basins, and it is showing how the extractive activity is fostering new towns and urbanizations in an almost rural and very fertile territory and ground that is the Alto Valle region, which is irrigated by this river you see in the map. We also saw that this is a region where that has a history of extraction, of dispossession, and of conflict, but that is very long. So I won't go in detail on this timeline, but basically all the regulatory frameworks of oil and gas exploitation in Argentina have been historically linked to the historical processes of occupation of northern Patagonia. We also saw, but with the research, that this is also a territory in dispute. So basically in Argentina, differently from other countries as the US, for example, the state has the ownership of the subsoil. And this means that through the figure of the concession, the subsoil becomes property of international oil companies that exploit it. They pay royalties to the state. However, land on the surface continues to be owned, lived and worked by families, by farmers, by agricultural producers, indigenous communities. And here is where the conflict begins, because fracking gives companies the right to invade their properties. So this is a map of the 1880s, where the territories was occupied by indigenous communities. And if we go to the next one, we see that in 1901, most of the indigenous communities were erased. The land was subdivided into plots. And if we go to the next one, we see that this land subdivision remains pretty much the same today. However, if we go to the next slide, we will see that now we should add a new layer of property that are these subsoil concessions, where most of them are from international oil companies. So in a way, all these layers of history, of land ownership, conflict are in Vaca Muerta at the core of most of the problems of the region. We can say this is also a region that is a productive and an extractive landscape at the same time. So in the next slide, we will see how this irrigated valley is where most of the urbanized areas are located, and also where the fracking activity is starting to happen. We can say the region is also shaped by these new territorial infrastructures. So this map shows fracking exploration lines that start to mark and to cross the territory. But there are also, if you go to the next slide, a set of power lines, gas pipelines, oleoducts and wells, new transportation infrastructure that are generating a very specific and particular type of urbanization where you cannot distinguish between rural and urban, between nature and infrastructure. In another scale of analysis, we also analyze the emerging boom towns of the fracking industry. There are towns that are growing very fast because of fracking without any planning consideration. So we analyzed two of these. One is Añelo and the other one is Agen. We see that Añelo is the epicenter today of Vaca Muerta. It's a town that has incremented 4 times its population since fracking arrived, and where we found huge tensions between residential, productive, and extractive areas. We can see which are the main urban problems in Añelo today that have to do with provision of housing, with this provision of housing for workers of the oil industry as well, with the uncontrolled expansion of the industrial park, and also with occupation of agricultural and rural lands, and occupation of indigenous communities' lands as well, and with all this huge infrastructure development that starts to cross the territory. In the case of Agen, Agen is another boom town of the Alto Valle. This is the productive node of the Alto Valle, whose traditional economic activity is the fruit industry, and where the fruit industry activity is starting to coexist with fracking sites. So in red in this map, we mapped all the plots or the fruit industry plots that have been converted into fracking sites. We see this is the landscape that starts to emerge in Agen, and this is the photos we could take when we went there in 2019, where we see that it's really sad to see how the food industry has declined since the arrival of fracking, how farmers' cooperatives are being closed as well. The idea, I wanted to synthesize some of the ideas and thoughts in this drawing. This is a very provocative drawing, but what I was trying to say is that although promises of development, fracking is leaving very little to local communities. And what we find today are really serious impacts of that plot and surface that go below and above itself, and that resonate thousands of kilometers away from that fracking plot. So fracking issues are associated to water quality and quantity, to contamination of underground water and rivers, to seismic activity, emissions, acoustic light contamination, among others. So in a way, if you go to the next one, please, So I would say that fracking and urbanism are tightly linked, that extractivism in these territories is being responsible for the generation of a very particular type of urbanism that can be described as these extended landscapes of urbanization. The question is then, what is the agency of urban design and planning in shaping these global gardens and their footprints? And also, I would say we can deploy a new narrative, policies and politics towards a fracking equity future. And with fracking equity, I would mean that all communities and stakeholders should have the same burdens and rewards and equal opportunities to participate in the policy and the decision-making for their territories. So I don't know if I'm on time. I hope that yes. And thank you so much. And I'll leave you with Barbara, I think.
Hello, I'm Barbara Schmidt-Rahmer, from a social entrepreneur from Brazil. Be delighted to be part of this fantastic group of speakers today. So I'm not a designer. I'm a graduate of the Harvard Business School, but I'm bringing you today a case very different from the two previous ones, also from Brazil, but it's the opposite extreme from Sao Paulo, large urban area. Here we are now going to a thinly settled area of northeast Brazil that's very little known outside of the country, actually. Next slide, please. Northeast Brazil, the semi-arid region of Northeast Brazil, where we'll be talking about the issue of access to clean water, is actually a vast territory of about 900 square kilometers, which would be about the size of Germany and France combined, where you have a population of 22 million people living in this area, which is, as a semi-arid area, the most densely populated semi-arid climate zone in the world. We have very little rain there, unevenly distributed and low levels of precipitation. Severe droughts have always been a problem in the area and are becoming more frequent and lasting longer with climate change. About 40% of the original vegetation adapted to these semi-arid conditions have been removed. Next slide, please. The insertion into the global economy, unlike the prior case, is fairly low, because you can see from the landscape picture here, really semi-desert conditions. It's considered that not much grows there. It's very hostile conditions in some way. So in a way, it could be considered perhaps an abandoned landscape in our global garden. Desertification, unfortunately, is accelerating. Average temperatures have been rising. In some places where they've measured where desertification is advancing most rapidly, you already have a 4 degrees centigrade higher temperature than today than the historical average. So this is a very dramatic situation here. Until the 1990s, the frequent droughts caused massive deaths of animals, hunger, food riots, human deaths also, and massive rural exodus. Widespread poverty in the region. It is one of the poorest areas still today of Brazil, but in up to 1991, the Human Development Index was still very low. So some areas here are basically on the level of some parts of Africa. Official policy to deal with drought originally was, until the 1990s, was to promote medium and large dams and water reservoirs, which would primarily benefit the large landowners. Brazilians refer to the drought industry. During the emergency drought periods, you would have massive distribution of food, which benefited large producers of food, and massive construction projects with labor brigades, which also, again, more benefited people who already are in better economic conditions, but left very little for improvements for the small farmer. So in the next slide, in the 1998, in the 80s, you start having alternative approaches emerge to the situation, community-based development strategies, mostly pushed by NGOs, very much a strong role of the Catholic Church and the NGOs related to it. Community gardens, small animals, rainwater harvesting started. We could catch rainwater to use it during drought. Then you have the watershed event of the 1992 UN Conference on Development and environment, which the NGOs present at the event issued the Earth Charter. So you see a change in development thinking, an acceptance of the idea of sustainable development and the Agenda 21. Then NGOs and social movements start getting stronger. And then in 1993, the movements and NGOs actually occupied SUDENA, which is the Brazilian government's development agency for the Northeast, because there was another catastrophic drought with, again, the same policy. So there was definitely a strong call for change. So then in 1999, finally, you have the COP3 conference in Recife, and this marks the beginning of ASA, which is a broad alliance of Brazilian NGOs in the semi-arid region of Brazil, the Semi-Arid Alliance. And they start to promote a new approach to drought. We cannot combat drought. Drought is a natural phenomenon, so we have to live with it and adapt to it. So this is the beginning of a new era. So next slide. In 2000, the Ministry of the Environment actually funds a first pilot project of the first 500 rainwater harvesting tanks. On the picture, you see a design of these tanks, very simple. Part of the structure is below ground, other part above ground. It collects the rainwater from the roof. The tank is a 16,000 liter tank, which is basically enough water for a family to live, for the family's consumption during the 4 to 6 month drought period you typically have in the northeast of Brazil. So basically then the ASA network, together with some NGO think tanks, developed a project, professionally developed project with financing, viability studies, etc., to roll out 1 million rainwater harvesting tanks in Northeast, rural households of Northeast Brazil. In 2004, you get a government that supports, we can go to the next slide, that actually invests, takes this program, 1 million rainwater tanks, as public policy and starts investing funds. But the interesting thing is that it leaves the execution of the program in the hands of the NGOs. And that's been a key differentiator. So basically what the ASA does as a strategy, it trains local people as stonemasons to actually construct these tanks. You have the use of local labor, purchase of local materials. So you get a whole spin-off into, it basically stimulates local economies. The families are trained in the use of the tanks, the cleaning and so forth, and in the maintenance. And so you get a whole positive spin-off from this. Basically, next slide, NGOs in the process qualify themselves to administer and execute public resources. Most of these grassroots NGOs had never had access to public resources before in their history, so they become more self-confident. They learn the bureaucratic procedures to execute public money, qualify themselves. It's a huge building of social capital in Northeast Brazil in this very difficult territory. As a result, ASA starts launching other social technologies. After the rainwater tank for households, you get a larger tank of 57,000 liters for irrigation and agriculture. You get seed banks, you get tree nurseries, and community revolving funds as mini capital venture funds in the communities. All of this is a spin-off from the first program. Next slide. The goal of 1 million tanks is reached in 2014. In 2011, the government does recruit other partners to help with this and puts in some tanks that are actually prefabricated for faster implementation. This caused some polemic, but it did help the faster implementation. The program does continue today, although with much lower government funding. It had massive benefits, improved health and nutrition. Women don't spend hours fetching water anymore, so their time is freed up for other activities. The program wins several national, international rewards, and in the most recent drought period, you no longer have that massive suffering and exodus that you had in previous droughts. Next slide. Basically, this slide is a map of ASA. I encourage you, people who find this experience interesting, to go to the ASA website. They have information in several languages. You click on the interactive map and there's tracking of the number of social technologies implemented. The government invested about $700 million US, next slide, in this program. So this is relatively cheap, actually inexpensive compared to other programs. There are new programs already coming up as new proposals now. The new ambitious goal of ASA is to put regenerative agriculture and food forests on 1 million hectares, again, led by the NGOs. We're still looking for funding for this project, but it's a new proposal on the table. Some concluding thoughts, first on the larger projects, inserted into the capitalist economy, the global economy. Are we making progress in considering the full, true environmental and social costs of these projects? Can we do a better job listening to local people? Can we channel a higher portion of the royalties from these projects to local organizations that can invest in their ways of improving their own lives? My own learning from this, when I immersed myself in these organizations and grassroots movements, I really discovered a potential. I discovered simple, local, inexpensive technologies, entrepreneurial drive, creativity, solidarity. These are the people with the low carbon footprint. We can learn from them. So we have a choice here. When we talk about this region, I was really stunned by the presentation this morning of Martha Schwartz, very devastating presentation. And here we do have a choice if we let climate change run its course. Areas like the Caatinga in Northeast Brazil will become uninhabitable, or we can invest in these local technologies, listen and incorporate the traditional knowledge. And these areas can thrive, but in the aspirations and the size of the dreams of the local people who live there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yes, thank you.
Our next panelist is Carolina Zambrano Barragan. She's the Climate Justice Global Lead at EVOS. She's a biologist and has a Master of Public Administration from Harvard University and a Master of Environmental Management from Yale. She has over 12 years of experience promoting climate action, innovation, and human rights within the public, philanthropic, and civil society sectors. She was previously director of EVOS, All Eyes on the Amazon, and Amazon Indigenous Health Route programs. Before joining EVOS, Carolina had leadership positions at the national and local levels in Ecuador, including Vice Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation, Under Secretary of Climate Change, and Director of Environmental Policy of the City of Quito. Carolina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adri. And I'm going to share with you today my experience as lead of the Amazon Indigenous Health Route, which is a program that works in the Amazon. So now I'm going to take you to the Amazon from the semi-arid region, as Barbara was saying. And I'm going to take you to the Amazon, and like me, I imagine that most of you, when I say Amazon, you imagine something like this: everything green, everything like a paradise, and filled with ecosystems, right? But I want to take you to actually the human Amazon. What a lot of people don't know is that there are cities in the Amazon, for example. This is Manaus, where 30 million people live. And then besides the people that live in the cities, there's actually 420 indigenous peoples that speak different languages and hold different cultures. So it is in this human Amazon that COVID arrived also in 2020. And a lot of people, a lot of different organizations tried to react to COVID and to support a COVID response in the Amazon. But we were working there with a program called All Eyes on the Amazon that works on indigenous rights and land defense. And what we saw is that everyone was focusing more on trying to respond to immediate urgencies, right? Trying to find food kits, for example, to try to get food and water to the region, or also hygiene products. But no one was actually thinking about structural changes to the health systems and how public health systems in Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil can actually respond to the priorities of people there. So what we first did is actually take a look at the map. What we did, of course, was first look at health coverage in the Amazon. And what we did is actually go to look to the official maps. So here you can see a small part of the map of the health infrastructure coverage with the Ministry of Public Health in the northern Ecuadorian part. As you can see, there are a lot of green and blue dots. And we actually found that there were more than 300 health facilities in the Amazon region of Ecuador, including 14 hospitals. So for someone like me, who lives in the city, in the capital, that looked like a lot and a very well and good coverage, but that didn't match what we were listening from people on the ground. And for someone that has been in the jungle or even in a forest, including my son next, you can actually realize that there are trees, there are paths, there's mountains, and there's also rivers that actually people that live there have to cross every day to go and plant, to go collect water, etc. So it's actually in this reality that we needed to find a response to actually improve health systems and access to health in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Also, what is going on in the Amazon, and perhaps not everyone fully lives that every day, is that there are a lot of different threats already going on and also influencing the well-being of the people, indigenous peoples and local communities, and also the health. For example, we have a lot of illicit crop plantations. We have oil infrastructure, oil spills, and most recently also forest fires, for example, and a lot of constant violations to human rights and indigenous people's rights. We also, if we compare the first slide where we saw the forest, we also have landscapes like this one that we can see related to both legal and illegal mining, land grabbing, and also forest degradation. And also, as I said before, what we saw a lot when Amazon on fire was everywhere in the social networks and in the news, was that there were a lot of fires in the Amazon, and that there still are. That this is the response, or this is caused not only by the interaction of climate change and deforestation, but actually what happened in 2019 is that there was a black market for each hectare burned in the Brazilian Amazon, because there's a land grabbing and there's the dispute for land, and actually the different interests caused this in the Amazon. And also because of climate change, of course, we not only have fires, but also a lot of different floods. This happened exactly in the same month as when the COVID-19 pandemic struck the Amazon here, that's in Ecuador. So in short, there's multiple menaces and threats that not only the Amazon forest, but people that live and depend on it constantly. And the same with deforestation, where we in the Amazon, we see a lot of forest deforestation and forest loss hotspots. This relates to conflict, and I think it's very important to mention conflict here, because this is an atlas, for example, of environmental justice and different conflicts related to natural resource extraction. And we see a lot of concentration of conflict related specifically to the Amazon region. Out of all the almost 300,000 environmental conflicts in the world, 40% affect indigenous territories, and there's like 400 in the Andean Amazon and in South America. So this is to give the context and the framework in which we have to respond and to see how, as an NGO, we could do something about these structural problems that were happening there. So our response was to not necessarily only try to bring in diagnostic tests or now vaccines, but actually to address the social determinants of health that are related to water availability, food security, the context of the forest and the preservation of the forests and the livelihoods of people. So from that perspective, what we did is create the Amazon Indigenous Health Route. This is a program originally supported by the Dutch Postcode Lottery and now the Rockefeller Foundation. And we had a whole strategy around 4 areas. One is placing the needs and rights of indigenous groups and peoples at the center of healthcare system, net systems, and also telehealth networks. The second one was adapting health promotion and behavioral change, and also disease prevention approaches and materials to be culturally relevant and also geographically relevant. Develop the capacities of indigenous health promoters, because it is the community health promoters that take care of their own, and also using digital technologies to expand digital surveillance capacity. So what we try to do is give life to this map that originally in the official system looks like this, but that actually needs to reflect where the rivers are, what kind of materials or oximeters, for example, we have in each health center, and what it implies for a person that is sick in a community A and that has to travel 4 hours by foot, then 1 hour by a canoe, etc., to reach a health center. And the fact that we actually needed to ensure that there would be someone there and there would be enough health equipment there to take care of that person. So we did something like this for all the Amazon regions that we work in Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, and so that people would know where to go. Another key part of this is that there's no way that we can face this kind of complexity alone. So one key message is complexity can only be faced through collaboration. And we did that through a coalition with indigenous communities, indigenous NGOs, and also the research and academia. We had like a step-by-step approach to how to reach and access healthcare, and also strengthen the different health networks in the territories, and also generate technical advice for policymakers. As I said, it strengthened the capacities of communities and community empowerment, and generated culturally adaptive communicational material. In general, what we have learned so far is that it is key for us to give the territory a face, and that territory for indigenous peoples equals identity. There's always a confluence in places like the Amazon of multiple pressures, factors, and threats, and access to services has to respond to rights-based approach and also indigenous sovereignty and governance. We also need to talk not only about design or land, but actually about the reconfiguration of power relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Now we'll introduce Félix Jaime Vaca. He's an architect from the Universidad Católica de Santiago de Guayaquil with a master's degree in spatial design from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. He is currently Director of Land Management and Urban Planning at the Puerto Viejo municipality. His role is to lead the technical team in the formulation of the multi-scale city proposal for urban development and risk management called Plan Puerto Viejo 2035, a planning instrument with emphasis in the development of new human-scale city that is also responsible with the climate. So Felix, please join us.
On behalf of the City Mayor, Agustin Casanova, thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you the Puerto Viejo experience in city planning and sustainable urban development. So I want to start this presentation with a general information about Puerto Viejo. And can you see, as you see in the map of Ecuador at your left, the country has 2 major cities, Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and Guayaquil. Puerto Viejo, on the other hand, is an intermediate city, capital of the Manabí province, located at the coast region of Ecuador. Puerto Viejo has a population of 320,000 inhabitants and 957 square kilometers of territory. During this administration that started in 2014, we faced an important challenge. On April 16 of 2016, Puerto Viejo was hit by a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. This earthquake destroyed most part of the city, leaving hundreds of buildings collapsed and damaged. However, this event was a turning point for Puerto Viejo. The earthquake gave us access to international cooperation and funding, especially from Germany, Spain, France, Japan, and also the US. In order to recover from the earthquake, we built a post-disaster city master plan with the collaboration of Gale Architects Studio and also with the collaboration of the University of Berkeley from the US. So this turning point was an opportunity to rebuild Puerto Viejo in a new resilient and sustainable way. And also we introduced new concepts such as human scale concept, that is a people-centered approach for urban planning. So we started the economic reactivation of Puerto Viejo post-earthquake. Can you go to the next slide? We started with 4 projects. So the first one was the Rotunda Park, that was a deteriorated space, also have many social problems, and was a very dangerous previous the intervention, but nowadays is a public space for sports and recreation, and also was the first green infrastructure we built post the earthquake at the year 2017. We also have another project of economic reactivation, such as the Alfara Plaza, a public space focused in the recovering of the architectural landmark we have in the city. So we create new spaces for the family, but also to enrich our cultural heritage and the culture Puerto Viejo and the Manabí province has. Also, we don't focus all the actions in just public spaces. We also design a new urban landscape for the city. This is the urban regeneration project for the city center, in which we introduce the new human scale concept, but focusing in street design. So this is a new approach, a new way that improves considerably the landscape and the landscape of the city. So this is the last project, is Las Vegas Park. This during the earthquake, this was a construction waste deposit for the building collapsed during the earthquake. So, and this also is our first nature-based solution design park. All these projects started after the earthquake in 2016 and finished in 2019. However, this is just a part of the city recovery strategy from the earthquake. From this point forward, we start creating a new local development plan to increase the city's resilience, but also to address all the climate challenges we will have in the future. As you can see in these slides, we did an analysis of the urban sprawl from the year 1985 to 2017. The analysis that was made by the New York University reveals that by the year 2050, if we don't have a proper city plan of the urban expansion, with less population, we will increase 5 times our land consumption. So this is not only a problem that people will consume more land, but also you will also have a major impact in our ecosystem, and also will increase the lack of basic infrastructure and multiply informal settlements located at risk zones. So we started the Puerto Viejo 2035 plan, a new urban development framework based on a new resilient and sustainable city model. This city model starts from the urban sprawl analysis, and then we create a new urban structure based in urban network system and a green infrastructure. The new urban structure helps us to reduce the land consumption, but also it helps us to improve the street network system, the urban green network of parks, and also the public facilities network. This, the first one, I started how was the urban network system framework. I will explain this one, that is the green infrastructure that focus in Puerto Viejo is main ecosystems, also focus in the peri-urban ecosystem and the urban green network of parks that I mentioned previously. This urban green network park is based on new parks of public spaces designed using a risk management, urban scale, and climate change approach. But also these design solutions are also focusing in the building of new nature-based solutions to recover new peri-urban ecosystems. So this is an example of our main ecosystems, main peri-urban ecosystems. These are the Puerto Viejo hills that, as you can see in the picture, they're endangered by the informal occupation and also land consumption of the forest. And this is another peri-urban ecosystem that we have is the Puerto Viejo River. It's not a river, it's also a a very green ecosystem that crosses Puerto Viejo at its center. As you can see in this map, you can see the transition of how first the Puerto Viejo hills surrounds and form a city limit, but also you can see at the center how the Puerto Viejo River cross all the city at the center. Also, the marks that you can see with orange are the informal occupation and the pressure human settlement have in this ecosystem. So in order to address these challenges in urban ecosystem, we use the nature-based people approach. So the nature-based people approach we have in Puerto Viejo, we have nature as representation of nature is the Puerto Viejo River, place is Las Vegas Park, and people is the appropriation of public space. So this is an example of how our nature-based solutions like link the peri-urban ecosystem with the city, but also offers the people or the citizens new high-quality public spaces that are also designed using a risk management approach that is an infrastructure that when the river overflows, it helps the city to contain to reduce the flooding risk. So this is the projects or the public spaces I mentioned before is a part of a 2035 green network system plan. So we have the goal to, at this point, we have 2.5 square kilometers of parks per habitant, but we have the goal to, by the year 2035, increase it to 14 square meters for parks. So to conclude, this is a result of 7-year administration that not only involves in city planning, not also is focused in city planning, but also with many other disciplines such as strategic planning, project management, risk management, social strategies, and the most important part that is a strong leadership. This presentation also shows the importance of how local governments have an important role to address climate challenges and how to overcome critical situations such as we did with the earthquake. Finally, I wanted to extend an invitation to the people connected to this event to visit Puerto Viejo and be part of this city transformation towards a new sustainable and resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Felix, and thank you all for this inspiring presentation and projects. After these almost 2 years of uncertainty at every level in Latin America, it's very refreshing to hear you all. And of course, this also brings us critical questions that I would like to address. My first question will be for Soledad and Rafael, but first I want to quickly reintroduce Soledad. Soledad studied urban design here at the ESD. She's an architect and researcher working for the Inter-American Development Bank. Her research and practice focus on projects that involve housing, vulnerable neighborhoods, and sustainable infrastructure at multiple scales. So Sole, Rafa, what is the agency designers can have in these expanded urbanized environments like Vaca Muerta and Sao Paulo region? Which alternative political frameworks would we need to operate in these highly contested areas?
So thank you, Juan, for your question. I think that's a very important question. And I think that as urban designers and planners, we have always been devoted to the design of the city, of the greater metropolis, but the years to come will be marked by these global gardens, by these extended landscapes of urbanization. And I would say that the agency of urban design would be first to advocate for the local, as we have seen in all our presentations, the importance in the transformation of the urban and of the landscape of considering and involving local communities in decision-making of their territories. And also would be very important to develop new narratives, stories, and alternative modes of development that are more just, more sustainable, more inclusive. Regarding your second question that is about the new political frameworks to operate in these territories, I would say they would have to involve and transcend geopolitics in a way, as I think that Kate mentioned in his presentation. Decisions cannot be circumscribed to the administrative or political boundaries of a city, of a town, but we'll have to deal with regional coordination and between towns and cities.
I think that building on Soledad's answer, I would definitely add to begin agree with what Soledad just presented. But I believe that there is significant opportunity to explore the municipal as a scale to begin with. But there's only so much the municipality can do, and that really scales up when coordination is front and center in that discussion. In the sense that if multiple municipalities are sharing a vision, they can act together on that vision, and from that vision derive what could be a plan. So, and that's what I think that the agents of design can come into the discussion as well. Perhaps us as designers, we as designers could contribute to this discussion. We could contribute to the political framework of this if we are able to coordinate around crafting with the communities that we're thinking about, with the municipalities that we're concerned with, craft together with them a plan and a vision that's able to leverage political force and momentum to enact the changes that we want to see, whether that's more sustainable forms of transportation, more sustainable forms of occupation of the territory, perhaps less extractive activities that leave permanent marks and scars on the land, and forms of occupying the territory that can be more generative for generations to come. So I think that we have a strong role in that, and we can really seize the opportunity to take part in that transformation that we all want to see and believe in. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's clear that we have to expand these notions of what is urban and what is rural if we are dealing with this implication of global gardens. So now I will go with Barbara and Carolina. In the context of Latin America, how can indigenous knowledge be part of the redesign of more nature-based and community-driven infrastructure development? Can designers have a crucial role in this engagement?
Okay, just to quickly start. I think they must be part of it by basically the initial step to that happening would be to events like this, for example, to make the indigenous and traditional knowledge more visible and more accessible. And that requires dialogue with those communities. Project leaders need to involve them, need to listen to them, need to have dialogue. I think it will happen as you have indigenous leaders and people from traditional communities go to universities and share their knowledge, and other people, from universities studying those, in the dialogue, studying these approaches and this knowledge. So I think it needs to start with a change in mindset. What we used to consider as backward, traditional, and so forth, all of a sudden, now that we recognize that our urban lifestyle is the one that's not sustainable, high consumption, high energy, and so forth, some of the traditional knowledge all of a sudden becomes extremely valuable again. And I think if we start with that mindset, the rest will fall in place. And I think that the role of designers in that is, again, having that mindset, listening, dialoguing, and then bringing to bear their specialized knowledge, as Walter Hood said in his fantastic presentation opening this panel.
I think I would go a little bit further than that, because I don't see it only as introducing and using indigenous knowledge, but actually having indigenous people participate in the whole process. No? So we're talking about also co-design of different alternatives and infrastructure. Just like in urbanism, you plan according to what society needs and the common good. I think it will be the same in ruralism, or the design of the rural, and how you actually take a look into cultures, customs, and also livelihoods, and base the solutions and access to services, for example, and infrastructure on that. So there is an urgent need to tie design to livelihoods, to integrate different ways of understanding community and culture into design, and then to generate this dialogue that also Barbara was saying. We're talking about designing, for example, a health center that we want people to use. But if we want indigenous peoples to use that center, then it has to respond to their culture and their communities. For example, there's a hospital in Mexico that changed the beds for hammocks for birth and labor, and that increased safe birth rates in their territory as well. So it's changing a little bit the framing. It's focusing on co-design, and then also, of course, in terms of putting the cultures, the rights, and the practices at the core of everything we do and think and design.
Thank you so much for bringing to the table the importance of engaging communities in infrastructure developments. Now, we will talk about implementation and temporalities. Felix, can you please tell us how can a master plan be sustainable in time in highly uncertain political and economical environments in Latin America? Would short-term infrastructure projects like the ones presented in this session be part of the solution if they are attached to a long-term vision?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. First of all, this urban development plan was designed or elaborated based on a new legal framework we have in Ecuador. It's called the Land Use and Land Management Law. Was approved just after the earthquake and gave the Puerto Viejo 2035 plan a validity of 12 years period. So this is not only an urban development plan, this is also connected to a land use and land management law. As you mentioned about the projects we have built for economic reactivation of the city post the earthquake, this is not isolated projects. This, for instance, Las Vegas Park is one of 7 parks projected along the Puerto Viejo River. So even though we have just made one infrastructure, it responds and also it's connected to this land use and land management law, and also help us to this plan or this urban green network proposal park we have to recover the river to transcend periods of amendment. So the future local governments have to have all the guidelines and all the planning instruments tools that are developed at this moment with this Puerto Viejo 2035 plan, and also help the future administration or other city mayors Puerto Viejo will have in the future with all the tools, instruments, and also how to continue this sustainable urban development vision we have for the city.
Thank you very much, Felix. Yeah, this vision about implementation in the region is critical for dealing with these topics. And thank you to this amazing panel for your thoughts and presentation. We are reaching the end of our 5th session, and I would like to encourage the audience to please reflect on these tools and skills that we need to develop in order to plan, design, and implement new regenerative and equitable forms of infrastructure in this climate change era. I'm sure we all have found useful and meaningful answers today, but more importantly, we are living with critical questions for the rest of our studies and careers in this challenging and crucial topic for the region and the world. Thank you all for your presence today.